No swearing, cutting and
as there is everything else that I've been messing up today. But let me know that there are some people out there. Perhaps you can pop in the chats, just let us know who you are, where you are, what kind of surveying you do, so that there we go, just stop some videos, there we go, so that we don't get the same mistake as last time. Hi Mike, great to see you up in Sheffield. I was talking to Phil Parnham today. I haven't spoken to him in ages. He's got a right beard.
I need a shave.
Yeah, me too. There we go. Right, we'll just give it a quick minute. There we go. So yes, what have you been up to today? Has the weather been good? Are you cold? I am flipping freezing today.
Right, it's because you're sitting by that old timber frame window.
It is, yeah, that single, yeah. It is.
As we discussed last time.
The one that John Edwards told me to just get a thick pair of curtains, Marion. Don't bother double glazing it. Thick pair of curtains.
Very sustainable timber frame window.
Yeah, except I don't know, I just never got around to it. Actually, my windows are absolutely filthy. I don't know if you can see they had some scaffolding outside while they were capping the chimneys just before Christmas. And they took the scaffolding down and it is just filthy.
Oh. I think scaffolders are probably the loudest trade as far as I can tell. They make the most noise. Even with, obviously I accept taking up and putting down scaffolding is loud, but just the scaffolders themselves, I think they get so used to shouting across distances and the noise of all the metal.
And I think because they're on the top, so they just sort of echo, don't they, everywhere?
Yeah, you can hear them from miles away.
You still wouldn't get me up there though.
No, on occasion I've gone up, but
I remember when I did a graduate job for a construction firm, Lang, and they were building some houses. They were like these experimental timber frame things at the time, and they built the scaffolding, and then they were going to drop the panels in. Yeah, and they had a site visit from one of the managers, and they all sort of scuttled around and then went up the scaffolding, and I'm sure they just did it to terrify me. And I climbed up, and you're just like, there's a drop there, this ain't safe.
no.
But yeah,
not my idea of fun.
Not my cup of tea. So who we got here? So Matthew from Bristol, hello. We've got Neil Trowick from Teesside, hello. Simon, hi Simon, hope you're keeping well. Is it Raphael? Is it Raf or Rafe? Or I was trying to think about how do you pronounce his name?
Raf.
I was thinking about just my next door neighbour's Raffaella. She's Italian. I was thinking Raf, right?
That's the female version. I've got mine's Noel. Mine's the Christmas version.
Raphael. Yeah, I got you. There we go. A few more people just to let in. Here we go. Oh, we got Anthony Parkinson too. Who else have we got? We've got Mark Pierce. Hello, Mark. Lovely to see you again. Mark's been on his travels. I'm trying to persuade him to do a podcast. Get in touch. We've got Steve, hello. There we go. What else have we got? Dominic, hello. There we go. Right. I will, as we've got a few people in now, and it's nearly 5 past. I'm going to ask everyone to turn their videos off and just make sure you're on mute, because we're going to record this and just pop it in the Surveyor Hub so that people can watch it on replay. I've pressed record, haven't I? Yes. And I'm going to hand it over to Tim. So for those who weren't on the last session, I catastrophically introduced Tim and then pressed a button to try and live stream it in the Facebook group, cut him off, but we carried on. He carried on talking for about 20 minutes.
Well, I carried on talking to myself for 10 minutes. So.
Yeah, nobody could get in touch with him because he was a professional and turned his phone off, and it was not ideal. So we're doing a replay. So thank you for those that have come up, and thank you very much to Tim. But I'm just going to hand over to you, Tim. Do you want me to manage the chat?
If you wouldn't mind, because I always get distracted talking about what I'm talking about and never remember to look at these things.
Yeah, so if there's we might sort of pause you know, halfway through or whatever, and I'll take my video off, and when I pop back then I can ask some questions. But
Yeah,
if you've got
that's
any
fine.
questions, guys and gals, then do you know, mention them in the chat, and I'll so off you go.
Right. Okay, bear with me 2 seconds. It seems to be playing up on me now. Perfect. Okay.
I was going to say I'd absolutely love it now if you messed this up and not me.
That went through my head. That genuinely went through my head. So anyway, hopefully nothing will go wrong this time, and we'll be talking to you for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll do some questions and some chat and bits and pieces. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Tim Kenny. I'm a residential surveyor based on the south coast in Chichester. Ex kind of DEA and just general working surveyor. Somehow I found myself doing more and more bits and pieces on sustainability and energy efficiency and bits and pieces. I now do training for SAVA, so I train their students around energy efficiency and sustainability, along with a few other bits and pieces. I was also involved in the RICS policy document, decarbonising UK real estate, which is not an entirely fascinating read, but I would recommend you all take a look at it. There is some really useful stuff in there for us as residential surveyors about EPCs, kind of setting out some of the problems with them, some of the things that can be done to resolve that. It's a great thing to have a look at, and if you get a chance to kind of publicise it, it's really helpful. I also sit on the RICS European Sustainability Working Group, just to do the kind of put forward what we as kind of humble residential surveyors can do to help in this area, and what we can really meaningfully do for clients and bits and pieces like that. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, how we as surveyors can report on sustainability. And hopefully if my clicker works. First thing we've got to do obviously is think about what we're actually talking about. So most of us are really aware of energy efficiency. That's great. We know what that means. It's, you know, how efficient it is to heat and run a home in the context of residential property. But sustainability is a little bit more involved in that. And we're really talking about how much impact property has on the natural environment, and the impact the natural environment also has on that property. The two kind of go hand in hand. It's not just about its direct impact, but how it can be affected as well. Energy efficiency is a part of that. You know, if you make a property more efficient, you are having less of an impact. But it isn't only the energy that has an impact. And we're going to look at some of those other aspects as well. Just to highlight this, I always kind of bring up this building. So this is the Marks and Spencer's building on Oxford Street. Been kind of a bit publicised recently because, in a way, understandably, Marks and Spencer's want to knock most of it down to build something that is obviously, firstly, much more usable for them, but also much more energy efficient. And it sounds great, doesn't it? You know, if you put an energy efficient building in, you're using less resources every day. Problem is, by knocking some of it down, you're actually going to release 40,000 tonnes of carbon into the system. So a lot of efficiency that needs to happen to offset that carbon. And that kind of, I give this example because it's kind of how we really need to start thinking about things. We shouldn't just be entirely focused on energy efficiency. We need to think a little bit more holistically. Well, I don't like the word. It's kind of probably best we've got to think about all aspects of the building and all aspects of how it has an impact, and obviously all aspects of how it is impacted as well. We're talking about anything, we always have to start with the RICS standards. And obviously we've got the home survey standards, which kind of covers a big chunk of what we do as residential surveyors. I'm not going to read it out to you. You're probably all well aware of this. You're probably all doing it really well. We've got these 2 pages. They tell you, you know, what you're supposed to do. And then we've also got Appendix C, knowledge of environmental issues in our locality. Again, you're probably all doing that really, really well. Of course, what none of this talks about is sustainability or the impacts of climate change on a property. So there is no obligation to do any of this within the home survey standards. For me, I think that's actually something, hopefully, that will change as things move forward. And part of what I like to do is make sure surveyors know more than they should on this subject. So if we have that knowledge base within the surveyor population to start with, that then starts to push through into what the regulations actually tell us to do. You know, a lot of the, if you look at a lot of the home survey standards, a lot of that came from the best practice that was already happening within the industry. Well, if we as surveyors can step up and do more about sustainability and about climate change, then we're already setting those best practices. When the next version of the home survey standards come out, I hope that in there somewhere they are talking about sustainability, they are talking about climate change, they are expecting more from surveyors in this area. So hopefully you guys can be part of building what is the best practice. The other reason we've got to look at this is things are changing. You know, the climate is changing. So we can see there we kind of have these little kind of blips, and this is the global surface temperature change, and it varies by location, and it is just the temperature change. But the temperature change has a big impact on other aspects of the climate as well. So who remembers Storm Ciara and Storm Dennis? And now I don't blame you if you forgot about these. They were very big news until not long after February 2020. There was some even more big news that took over. But these were two extreme storm events that happened one on top of the other. A lot of flooding, a lot of property damage, a lot of issues that were caused by these two events. Now, these extreme events are becoming more common. There's going to get to the point where these extreme events are no longer extreme. They're much more every day. And we have to think about how they're going to impact the buildings that our clients are buying now, because they're already being affected. Because if you look at this little graph, it shows you a distribution of the age of property in this country. Right? And as you can see, quite a big chunk of it is pre-1980. Well, if we flick back 2 slides, we look at 1980 on this graph, and I don't know whether you can see my pointer, well, that's really when things started to change. So we know most of our buildings were built before really we had any kind of concept of how the climate was going to change, how things were going to adapt and develop. Even now, we're still kind of maybe stabbing in the dark a little bit, and we'll talk about why some of that may be a little bit behind. But there's also obviously, you know, fundamental surveying truth. I find this answer really useful anytime I'm dealing with students and not sure on the answer. You always find these things, well, why was it done like that? And the answer is because it was cheaper. You know, we all know that houses are, or buildings are generally built to a cost, try and keep that cost down as much as possible. So we only really do what we have to do. So houses are being built to the regulations or the common practices as they were at the time. And those common practices were based on, the regulations were based on the prevailing conditions at the time. So, you know, back in the 80s, they were building their houses based on what they expected the climate to be in the 80s. We already know there's been a big change since then. So are our buildings really going to be fit for the climate as it is now, let alone how it's going to be in 5, 10, 20 years' time? And, you know, we can say, okay, well, we inspect a property as it is today, but also we've got a liability that extends potentially up to 15 years. And 15 years of climate change can talk some big changes. So our clients may be expecting something more from us. And we maybe need to start thinking about it and explaining some of that. And I'm going to go through 2 kind of examples in a bit of detail to kind of explain my thinking and how some of this can be reported. And then we'll go through some of the other bits a little bit quicker and maybe get into some discussion. And I like to start with gutters and rainwater pipes. So if you know, they're covered by approved document Part H, drafted in 2015 to bring into force section of the Building Regulations 2010. Building regulations say adequate provision shall be made for rainwater to be carried from the roof of the building. And then Part H goes on to tell us what is adequate provision. And the main section of it is this map. So this map tells you, if you find your part of the area that you're in, it works out your kind of the average rainfall intensity, and then it specifies some calculations as to what level of flow you need from the rainwater gutters. That's how they work out how much guttering you need, how much drainage you need, and everything else. Now, my problem with this, if we flick back a slide, if these regulations were drafted in 2015, well, that is now, what's that, 8 years ago now that they were drafted, and they're based on this map, which will have been based on historic data. So this is data from before 2015. Well, again, you know, we can see how much change there's just been in the last, 5, 10 years. This data that's, by definition has to be out of date is already going to be more out of date than it was in 2015. So we're kind of, ideally this should be revised now, and we should be thinking, okay, well, how are we going to check the buildings in the future? But also everything that was being built in, even to these ones which are out of date, and everything before that which were being built on different standards, are they really going to be coping with the amount of rainfall that we generally expect to get? Now, the way climate change is going, we are getting obviously hotter, drier summers, but we're getting warmer, wetter winters with more severe weather events. So are the gutters on a building going to be suitable? Now, I don't think we as surveyors should be telling people that, or trying to make some form of assessment of this. We should certainly be looking a lot more closely at potential problem with gutters. And again, I'm sure you already are. You know, we know that rainwater goods are one of the primary drivers of water ingress in properties. So we should all really be looking at that. I think we should be looking even harder than we probably already are. We really should be putting a lot of focus on those. We should also be thinking about what happens when they overflow. So approved document H3 paragraph 1.7 states that the gutters should be laid so any excess doesn't fall into the building, it falls onto the ground. Again, the problem with that is we know that we're going to get more extreme weather events, which means we're going to get much more sodden ground, which means we're going to get much more flooding, which means the rainwater that's overflowing is just going to add to that. You know, so we've got this significant problem. So what are we going to do? Should we be telling them that actually, you know, your house was built 10 years ago, you're probably going to need to change your gutters? I'm going to say probably not, because at this stage, we should be warning them of the problem. We should say, look, you may find that as the climate changes, you're going to have to think about your guttering arrangement. You should think about maybe when you have to replace your guttering, maybe think about over-engineering it. You know, go for more flow than you would, you know, would be considered normal under building regulations at this stage. But again, coming back to the Marks and Spencer's building, there's no point stripping out all of that nice plastic guttering that is kind of functional because it's plastic. What's going to happen to it? It's going to go in landfill, it's going to leach chemicals into the ground, it is going to cause a problem. So actually, you know, we maybe need to kind of think about keeping what's there, but if it does fall apart, and if you are looking at a building where the guttering is an utter state, maybe it needs to be improved, maybe it needs to be taken out anyway. At that point, you should definitely say to, you know, particularly on a level 3, yes, replace this guttering, but think about the additional capacity. And again, that travels through to the underground drainage as well, you know, where you've got, for example, a combined drainage system. Again, I would be, you know, seeing any kind of combined system as suggesting actually maybe you do need to get that, get a CCTV camera inspection of that. You know, ideally everyone should have one anyway, but I'd probably be making my wording, my advice much stronger to a client where there is that combined system, because we do have this increased risk of heavy rainflow and that additional load on the system. But again, you know, even with soakaways and everything else, they're going to be taking much more load than they were expected to be taking. So how are they going to keep performing? So I would suggest to everybody, you know, at least at the very, very least, have a note in your reports that says to a client, you know, be careful, your gutters might not be fit for purpose in a few years' time when we get more weather. At the very minimum, that's kind of covering you. You know, if their gutters start overflowing in 6 months' time because there is some really extreme weather, you can point to that section in the report. That's a minimum. I don't ever advise anyone does a minimum. You know, we have the home survey standards. They're a minimum level of a minimum requirement. We always want to do better than that. And, you know, and the same with this. That's a minimum to suggest that maybe you want to think about it, but maybe you might, if you're capable of going further. The other one then that we'll look at in a little bit more detail is overheating. So we've established that winters are going to get warmer and wetter, summers are going to get hotter and drier, and it's the heat that is the potential problem. So here we've got 2 possible solutions, obviously air conditioning on the left there and shutters on the right. No prizes for guessing which one is the more sustainable option. Shutters are an amazing way to keep solar heat out of a building. Yeah, I actually had to find a picture of shutters from abroad, because it's not something we commonly do in this country, but external shutters are the best way of dealing with the heat. You know, certainly much more energy efficient than your air conditioning system. Need much less maintenance, much cheaper to run, much cheaper to install. So maybe that's something we need to start thinking about advising our clients as to these better options. And again, we have Part O of the building regs covering overheating, obviously drafted in 2021. So it's a very, very recent bit of documentation. And obviously it says you've got to limit unwanted solar gains and provide an adequate means to remove heat from the indoor environment. So to kind of say what those 2 are. So one on the right is limiting solar gains, one on the left is removing unwanted heat. That's how those systems are working. Obviously, as with all building regulations, they're not all retrospective, so we don't have to make sure that everything already built meets these, but we can use them as a good starting point for guidance as to what might be suitable in a property, much as we do with everything else. For example, stair pitches and the whole lot of it. We can take this documentation and we can say, hang on, it says in here, if you do that, it might not be good. Well, I've got a property built 10 years ago. They didn't do this reasonably, because they weren't told they had to. But I can think about maybe suggesting that they consider these aspects, or if I'm seeing that, I know they might have a problem. And how part of building regulations works, they make it nice and simple for us simple residential surveyors. There's a whole complicated section for commercial and other bits and pieces. But for residential property, you've got these two tables, and quite simply, it just tells you what percentage of glazing is suitable for the size of the room, depending on the orientation and depending on the level of cross flow and ventilation within that space. So you can see that, if you've got a room that has no cross vent or has cross ventilation, is facing north, then it can have 15% of the floor area as glazing. So quite straightforward, really. I mean, again, I wouldn't say that you would need to go around and measure the floor area and measure the glazing. You could do that if that was you wanted to go a little bit further, but you've got perhaps some rough guidance to look at and go, actually, hang on, those windows roughly look more than 15%. Therefore, I think they may be likely to be affected by solar gain and too much solar gain. So actually, maybe I need to think to my client, okay, well, you've got that big window there, it's facing this direction, therefore you're going to get problems. Maybe think about some remedial action to deal with that. And I use this one as an example. So we've got a property that I surveyed, listed building. This one apparently really good work on this. A lot of this really done well. Didn't find too much wrong with it. Problem is, they didn't really have all the right listed building consents in place. So my buyer pulled out in the end. It's ridiculous. Even won a heritage award somehow without all the right paperwork in place. But anyway, this particular section, obviously, this is into a kind of a dining area and into a kitchen. We have this big glaze section, and we've got glass on the top of it. We've got quite a lot of glazing for the floor area. So there is a potential risk of solar gain. As it happens, it's in a kind of a really sort of shaded spot. There's tinting on the glass and it's got that slight overhang. So it's not likely to cause a problem. Obviously, I inspected it in, I think it was early spring. So I couldn't be sure of that. Flag it up as a potential and to be aware of it, but I wasn't too worried. But again, that's the sort of thing we can start to think about. We can also start to look at some of the other matters that might increase likelihood of overheating, and there's a good list there. So located in an urban heat island, I mean, that basically means London. But again, if you're based in London, you're going to be aware of the increased heat and everything else, and obviously those of us in perhaps more rural or suburban locations, not quite the same problem, but be aware of it. Located on the top floor of an apartment block. So again, heat rises, you're at the top, it's going to get hot. Located on ground level or adjacent to an access balcony in an apartment block. Again, busy road, because some of these are mainly because you're less likely to open the windows. If you're on the ground in an apartment block or straight out onto the street, or in maybe an area with a relatively high crime rate, you're a lot less likely to open your windows. So you're going to sit there stifled in a hot room because you don't feel safe to open your windows, or you may feel there's too much noise outside, therefore you leave the windows closed, and therefore it's going to get hotter in there. And again, you say, busy railway lines, industrial plants, etc. People don't want fumes and smoke and everything coming in, so they keep the windows closed. South through the west. So again, sun rises in the east and sets in the west, passes kind of to the south of us. So we're going to get all of that solar gain coming in through the day. Little thermal insulation. We always think about insulation as keeping the heat in. It also keeps the heat out. So if you're in an uninsulated building, freezing cold in winter, really hot in the summer. Again, very little ventilation. So again, we think about ventilation in terms of condensation and mold and those problems that do come with it. But actually, it can also cause traps in the heat, doesn't it? So again, if you're at a property, think about some of these factors. Think, are they, much as we would do with anything else. Sometimes we don't look for the problem. We look for some of the factors that might lead to that problem. So with this one, we can look at these and go, hang on, you've got X, Y, and Z in place. Therefore, you probably will find you do get hot in the summer. So even though I'm standing there in the middle of winter, I could make a reasonable assessment that's going to be too hot in the summer. And again, heat is obviously it's uncomfortable, can be a risk to health. Last summer how hot was it last summer? 40 degrees. Would you want to be sat in a flat at the top of a building with no windows open and no insulation and baking, pretty much in an oven? That is going to be a risk to health. And we as surveyors have an obligation to comment on risk to health. So actually, I talk about a lot of this not being covered by the regulations. This could be, you could make a reasonable case that actually you've got to protect your client from health risks, and this could be one of them. Obviously, other side, the things that decrease the likelihood of overheating are pretty much the opposite of the ones that increase it. External greenery. So we know that trees and plants and everything else, they bring down they create more of a microclimate, they bring down the heat. So again, look around your building. Again, we always focus on the house itself. We should focus on the local environment as well. Windows to room facing north through east. So again, they can be open, let the sun out. External shutters, we talked about, they're a great way of keeping the heat out before it enters the building. Internal shutters are okay, but the heat has already got in, so it's not as good. And obviously, windows and air conditioning and everything else, and thermal insulation to the roof keeps out the heat in the summer. These things can be really, really useful ways of keeping the heat out. So they're they're two kind of areas just to give you an idea of the way you can start thinking about it. But also there are lots of other areas we can talk about, and I want to do about 15 minutes or so on some of these, so we'll whiz through a bit, and then if you've got any questions or comments or want to just chat through things, then we will do. Obviously, shrinkable clays is one that we really should all be thinking about. I'm in a shrinkable clay area, so I'm very much aware of it. I've got a patch of ground next to my house where I was literally just watching the ground pull away from the side of the wall this summer because of how dry it had been. You could literally see that movement in the ground. In 2022, they reckon claims will likely surpass the previous record of 2018. So we can see that, the last time we had a record was 2018. I think the record before that was back in the 70s. So, we can see an escalating pattern of increased risk of ground movement due to shrinking clays. So even if, again, I would strongly advise everyone to have some kind of comment in their reports. If you're in a clay area, you need to be saying, obviously, yes, look for evidence of subsidence, look for the evidence of movement as it is today, but also be warning your clients that the risk of movement is going to increase over time. It is going to get worse. They're going to get more chance of a problem in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, or whatever it is, because we're going to be getting drier summers. They need to be warned of that risk and the impacts it could have on insurance, for example, let alone the physical damage that can occur to buildings. And again, I'm not a massive fan of some of these things. I say like I'm trying to just cover yourself, but actually this is meaningful, useful information. Yes, if you can cover yourself, make sure you're not being burdened with a liability, that's great. But also it's really useful for them. They can really start to be aware of this issue. Even maybe give them more information as to what to look out for if they're in a shrinkable clay area, so they can keep an eye out for the cracking and they can spot it maybe at a relatively early stage. Bump up the advice or the guidance you're giving to them so they can think about some useful things for them. Wood-boring insects is another one that I like to kind of think about. So obviously this is a map of France. I'll kind of explain why I'm referencing this in terms of where we are now. So this is actually a map showing the distribution of termite infestations in France. So you can see there's a very, very clear line there with the kind of southeast of France is the area that's most affected. Now, the thing is, as we get hotter weather, climate changes, that line is going to start creeping up through France. And you're going to find termites are actually becoming much more common in more northern locations. Why this is relevant to the UK is we don't have to wait for that line to go all the way up through France before it then gets into England, because our climate is different from France. We get some areas of our country are warmer than the northern sections of France because of the way because we get the jet stream that keeps our country warmer. To take an example, where I'm in Sussex, we now have the perfect conditions for growing champagne variety grapes, and we make very good sparkling wine. Well, that's, you know, an area. I think my French geography is not great, but I think the Champagne region is kind of, it's down here somewhere, isn't it? So now if you think, okay, well, Sussex up here somewhere, kind of equivalent climate to down here. Well, hang on, that's not a million miles away from areas where they're getting termite infestations. And now I know we obviously had one down in Cornwall, I think it was, and they spent how many years treating that. But if you haven't looked into that, do look into the infestation in Cornwall. It is a fascinating little case study. You know, they weren't allowed to take any timber off those sites. I think, in fact, the owners of one of the sites had to apply for special permission to build a termite-proof building on their land that they could live in while all this was going on, because they certainly couldn't sell them. So we're currently considered termite free as a country, but that could very easily change as the climate changes as well. And obviously, you know, I use termites as a kind of extreme example, but the same applies to all wood boring insects. You know, as our climate gets warmer, ET is going to become more conducive to their spread. Obviously, yes, they need damp timber, they need the decaying timber to really get going, but certainly they need the warmth as well. So again, you know, yes, you're looking out for wood boring insects, but again, think about maybe saying, okay, well, look, even if you found what could be a dormant infestation, mention that, you know, if the climate changes, we could find that wood boring insects become more of a problem. We might find that, you know, what was a little slow growing infestation somewhere, we get a bit of warmth and maybe damper weather at some point, we're going to find that exploding off, and we've got a bigger problem. So again, think about that useful advice for your client. Flooding, this is the one that, you know, you talk about climate change risk and everyone just suddenly mentions flooding. That's the one everyone seems to focus on. And it's true. And again, as we talked about with the extreme weather events, we are going to get more flooding. 1 in 6 properties in the UK is at higher risk of flooding than ever before in comparison with historic data. That's quite a big chunk. 1 in 6 of our properties is at a higher risk of flooding than it was before. So again, you know, think about not just saying, yeah, you're in a flood risk zone or you're not in a flood risk zone. Say, you know, you might not be in a flood risk zone now, but as climate change, as climate change kicks in, as we get these changes, that may change. You may find yourself you suddenly become in a flood risk. Obviously, you as a surveyor you can't predict this, you can't be certain about anything. You know, I've seen maps saying that pretty much where I live, I'm going to be on the coast by 2050. I'm literally going to be able to see water out of my back window by 2020. At the moment, I'm a good few miles, you know, a couple of miles inland. So everything south of me is going to be underwater. Again, I don't know how accurate that is. I don't know how you know, reliable those predictions are, but you know, these are some of the risks that could occur, and we need to maybe start thinking about bumping up what we tell our clients on this subject. Another one is car chargers. Obviously, from 2030, we'll see a ban of all the sale of new internal combustion engine cars. You know, a lot of people are already driving electric cars, and that's great, and it's going to affect the way, you know, it's going to be a massive change. It's a really important thing, and obviously there's a lot of discussion about infrastructure that has to go with that, and public car charging points and everything else. Again, domestic and within residential property, we need to be telling our clients that, you know, there is no car charger at this point. We've got to remind them of the fact that this might happen, and obviously put one in, and that's fine for properties with a driveway or a garage or whatever. But obviously, perhaps terrace properties that are straight out onto the road, you know, the old Victorian terrace, where are they going to put their car charger? Are they going to have to rely on public charging points? My other personal big concern is blocks of flats. You know, you get the blocks of flats with their shared parking spaces and shared parking areas. Where are they going to put car chargers in this? I don't think they can't really. You know, freeholders are not permitted to use service charge funds for improvements to leasehold property. They can only use it for maintenance and repairs. Fitting a car charger, well, that is going to be an improvement. Let alone then you've got to connect it into the electrical system. So you're going to connect that to the communal electricity supply. You're then going to try and recharge that electricity from between everybody else. Is each resident going to have to connect up to their own ones? It's just not workable. So you're going to have whole blocks of flats where you will not be able to put in car chargers. it's not, I can't conceive a way that anyone's going to make that happen. So again, I think it's reasonable to be warning clients about that. You know, you should be telling people, look, if you buy this property, putting in a car charger is going to be very difficult. You therefore may have to rely on public charging points. And so they can at least start thinking about that. And again, you know, a lot of these things, they're kind of common sense, but my view is always that when you buy a house, there is so much going on, isn't there? There's half a ton of paperwork. I remember when I last bought a house, you know, I'm a surveyor. I was quite fortunate. My mum is a conveyancer, and she did the conveyancing for me. I still found it incredibly stressful. You know, I should be in a good position to understand exactly what's happening, but it was a stressful situation. There's so much going on. I'm not going to think about everything I need to think about. And one of the things that we need to do as surveyors is do that little bit of common sense thinking for our clients, because we're not emotionally involved. We're the trained, experienced professional. We can think about these things. It might be seem quite straightforward, but that could make a big difference to someone's decision as to whether to buy a particular property. And, you know, we need to start thinking about these things. Home working. Again, this is kind of another potential issue. You know, we need to start thinking about those properties that maybe don't have ability for people to work from home, or perhaps more positively, do have good positive aspects that allow them to work from home. So, you know, an external building that is connected to power and is heated and insulated and everything else that they could work from, and these things. So home working is a big part of it. But again, we maybe also need to think about residential leasehold property and also freehold estates. Many of these will contain within their leases and transfer documents restrictions preventing running businesses from those properties. Now, my view is that they're very, very difficult to enforce. I live on a freehold estate and I work from home. Technically, I'm in breach of the terms of my transfer, but I know that's impossible to enforce. Possibly more so on flats, and in theory, a freeholder could come along and say, no, you're working from home and could take legal action. Again, it's a low risk, but again, quite reasonable to point out these issues, because we know so many people are now working from home. Access to green space. And again, we know that access to green space is as effective as medication for treatment of depression. You know, we now get to a stage where we have doctors what we call social prescriptions. So for these kind of depression and anxiety related illnesses, they are actually prescribing people, you know, social engagement and working within green spaces and forests and everything else. We know it is effective. The other side of that is we know that if somebody doesn't have access to green space, then they're going to be negatively impacted by that. It can actually have the effect of making issues around depression and anxiety a lot worse. So again, we've got quite a severe health risk. You know, depression is a major issue within society. It impacts a lot of people in quite a severe way. So if we know that somebody's buying a property that has no access to green space, because it doesn't have a garden, or it's in a built-up area with no access to any kind of greenery at all, we know they are, in a sense, taking on a risk. They're risking their health by buying that property. And again, you know, big part of our job is to protect our clients against health and safety risks. So somebody buying a property without green space, do we have an obligation to do that? Okay. I think it would be a hard push to kind of, you know, for somebody to link their depression to the lack of green space and then sue the surveyor for not telling them. But again, you know, I think that, you know, say compliance is not the same as being, you know, if you're compliant, doesn't mean you're a good surveyor. And just because the standards don't say you have to do it, doesn't mean you can't do it. You can choose to go above and beyond. And again, you know, a lot of these, what I think is, you know, the kind of perhaps the final reason I give for why I think a lot of these are important is because a lot of other surveyors don't do them. You know, we've seen the market is slowing down a bit. You know, we get the quite regular conversations about, you know, about the fee levels and everything else, and big firms who are actively dropping their prices and trying to seek all the work they can get, and that's fine, and they're doing that based on price because they're offering a compliant service. Okay, well, if you don't want to compete on just the lowest price, you want to compete on a quality service, well, then look at the ways that you can offer more. And again, we know people are much more interested in issues around sustainability. Obviously, energy efficiency is a massive thing, and it is playing it's important, and you know, the fact that it's within the home service standards is great, and the more you can do on that, the better. But we also know people are more informed about general issues around sustainability. They are more concerned about that. And even if they're not aware of how it can be impacting the property, not aware of the fact a surveyor can do it for them, if you tell them, well, then you're looking really good, aren't you? You're kind of giving something they didn't even know they wanted, and perhaps they'll pay more for that. Couple more, obviously, recycling, again, within the same vein, again, could be seen as common sense, but just make them aware of what facilities they do have, or again, make them aware of the lack of facilities. And again, this you know, this can be quite common with blocks of flats that don't have the facility for recycling bins. They do still exist, blocks of flats that you cannot have any recycling at. If you can easily identify that as a surveyor going around, because you won't see anything marked up as recycling. Tell your client, make them aware. You know, it could be an important factor in their decision. who goes on a house viewing and looks at the bins? You know, it's not something common people are going to commonly do, but you as a surveyor looking at the bin store anyway. Reducing water use. Again, we talked about the problems that can occur with the gutters, but again, other side of that, summers, we're going to get droughts, we're going to get problems. So start thinking about how you can give your clients some guidance on this. You know, we've got two obvious solutions there. Obviously on the left we've got the rainwater, but on the right there we've got a rainwater harvesting and recycling system. So that then collects the rainwater, pumps it back into the property. It gets used for flushing toilets and cleaning clothes. Apparently you're allowed to clean clothes with your rainwater, which I always find a bit strange. But again, you know, we could at least be signposting them to some of this information. And I've used the word signposting. Marion reminded me of this last time, and it's a great word to think about. You know, we don't have to be the experts on this. We don't have to know all of these things, but we could perhaps signpost our clients to where they can find proper expert information. You know, be that point in between them not knowing and the person that really understands it. You're then pushing them towards that person who does understand. And I think that is the end of my slides for today. So I will take myself off screen share. Remember how to do that. There we go. Perfect.
Cool. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Tim. This is still being recorded, so if anybody wants to come off and be videoed and ask a question, you can. Or if you want to ask a question, pop it in the chat or let me know, and I will unmute you and you can ask the question. I think that makes sense. Couple of things that I think as you talk about that, we've got to be really, well, it expands the whole parameters of what is a survey in the traditional sense, and how far out do we go and what are the boundaries. And I know there'll be some people watching this thinking, well, I just want to inspect the building, you know, and we've got to think wider, haven't we? And I, you know, everything changes and we've got to be thinking more sustainably, you know, in a different way. And that might mean actually for some of us we need to upskill. You know, this year I'm going to do some retrofitting courses. Might not use them, but it's going to be, it's a bit geeky for me, but you know, because it's the knowledge and it's increasing it, and you know, the impact that can have, and educating yourself. So I think there's a couple of things. One, people should be planning their CPD. Don't get to, you know, Monday, I think it is 30th of January, and get your CPD in, you know, scratching around for different things. Plan it intentionally. And if sustainability and things like that isn't something that you really cover, then that's what you need to do. You need to plan it.
On that subject, I'll just mention I know the College of Estate Management were doing a sustainability and I think retrofit free 25-hour course if you go to the College of Estate Management. So that's, you know, for free, 25 hours. That's your requirement to get it done.
And I think there's a good place to look locally even. I've done 2 courses actually with Cranfield University, which is not far from me, and they've had courses for businesses on how to get to net zero. So it's not just about the building, it's about how you as a business can be more sustainable as well, but it's got lots of contacts and tools and things in there. So it's all about that awareness. There are 2, I think, retrofit training centres. One is that I know of, one is, oh God, it's called something like retrofit, I can't remember, and the other one is the environment centre that John Edwards runs. And if you haven't heard, I did a podcast with him at the end of last year, and I know they run some courses. And I think some of them you get quite a mixed bag as to who's on there. Are they surveyors, or are they people who are just setting themselves up to do spray foam installation or whatever? I don't know.
Oh, that one.
But the first thing is to ask about in the Surveyor Hub. I'm sure it's come up. Just ask the question: what courses have people been on? What would they recommend? Word of mouth is always best.
So many of them are online now that wherever you are, somebody mentioned whether anything covering West Sussex, I know they're all pretty much virtual. I know Kate Charrington does a lot of the teaching for one of them. I can't remember which one she teaches on, but that's all virtual stuff. So don't worry, wherever you are, you will find somebody who's offering something useful. And as I say, a lot of those courses are around obviously the retrofit roles and the retrofit assessors and inspectors and coordinators, and there's this whole kind of set program, and that's great, and hopefully that will roll in and that will bring in more people. But anything you can do to build up your level of knowledge in this area, I think, is going to be extremely helpful.
And we've just had a question here, which is something I was going to come on to. How do you balance the advice against feeling like the advice you're given against feeling like you're just adding additional caveats in your report? And I think for me, I don't know what your view is. For me, I would take this a step back and say, what is your client asking for and what are you offering? And get really clear on that. And I think a lot of surveyors don't. They just say, this is what I do. Here you go. So they miss the opportunity to add value. So get that really clear and make sure your terms are there. If they're asking you for, a holistic whole approach to energy efficiency in the house, is that in your skill level or not? Or can you signpost or get other people in? So just be really clear on that. But I think there's an awful lot that you can do by way of signposting, marketing, useful information on your website that can help people be more sustainable without actually putting much more in your reports. So you mentioned about local recycling centres, where the nearest this, that and the other is. That's massively helpful stuff that you can all put on social media, and you can have a page on your website. And if customers have questions, you just signpost them to it, because at the moment there isn't one source of the truth, of what it means to be sustainable and retrofit and all of that. And so it's really hard for us to say as surveyors, this is what it is, but you can advise them as to the uncertainty of that. But here are some other things you might want to do. And so it's signposting rather than advice that you then need to caveat, because it's a massively changing picture.
I think also to kind of come back to your point about what's a caveat and actually what's just useful advice. Again, it's a caveat and it's not meaningful. And caveats are important. We have to be clear about the level of what we're telling somebody. But unless you're actually giving something they can actively use, it's a caveat. So this idea, this I mentioned about talking about guttering. Yes, by explaining that your guttering may not be fit for purpose in a few years' time, they can't. That's a caveat. That protects you against their guttering suddenly overflowing next winter and kind of protects you. But also you're telling them, if you need to replace your guttering, think about going above and beyond. So they've got an action they can take with it. It's find something that is a benefit to them as opposed to just protecting you. A caveat would be, I can't predict how your guttering is going to work in the future. And that's true. But, it doesn't take much to put a paragraph that says, we know the weather's going to get worse. We know your gutter was built for different climatic conditions. When you do need to change it, maybe make it better.
You see, this is where I think we're talking about sustainability, but where our approach to how we create surveys and the advice we give to clients needs to change. Because what we do is we see a gap and we stuff it with bullet points and stuff it with caveats, when actually if we take a step back and look at what do they want, do they know how to live in a property like this, do they know what to do, you actually then start talk more about supporting them to live in the property. Now that might sound a bit naff because we all know how to live in properties, but actually we don't know how to maintain things. We don't know how to stop condensation. Most of us can't be bothered. And it's just like being at school, we're not taught home ec and how to cook anymore. We're not taught any of the skills of what it means to maintain a home. So with the housing stock we've got, and so we've, you know, when I used to do surveys many years ago, and I used to, you know, get people to get the B&Q DIY manual, which was £9.99, and particularly for first-time buyers, because it had big pictures in that you could say, you know, if you had a builder, look at this, you know, this is what I want done. You know, and you know where you were being ripped off or not, but there's nothing like that, you know, at all. And so this is where we get more into understanding maintenance, what people are going to do, and you don't have to give them the B&Q DIY manual, but you can signpost them and have the conversation that buying something that needs love, care, attention in a sustainable way, and set the scene for that.
I think that's a really good point. I think because part of it is obviously level 2. We don't really talk about maintenance, do we? We talk about the current condition, the problem, and how severe the problem is. It's only in level 3 that we start to get into how to maintain the building. So that's missing from level 2. We kind of almost, I don't know. We're almost assuming that buildings don't need maintenance because we're not going to mention it.
The thing is that, you know, level 2 and level 3 are just minimum standards. They are not, you know, they are not stick to measure by. They've got enough space that you can put whatever you want in there. And I think we, you know, whilst we have a duty to explain the levels, what we shouldn't be doing is selling, here's level 2 and 3, what do you want? We should be selling, here's the service, here's what I offer, here's what I can help you with. It just so happens as reassurance to meet level 2 or 3.
It's this,
totally changes it, and that's how you get higher fees, but also how you then really target the messaging in terms of sustainability and finding different ways to, you know, to address that. So go on.
So I was going to say something. I know again, this comes back to people don't really know what they want as well when they're asking for a survey. I mean, most people have
no bloody idea what a survey is.
So again, I would say, okay, well, if somebody's coming to you and asking you about insulation, for example, and how insulation is, that's useful. That, you know, that shows they are thinking about energy efficiency. So if you're then talking to them, you say, yes, I will report to you. I'll talk about the energy efficiency. I'll look at the EPC. I'll make suggestions of what you can improve. I'll say the things that maybe are wrong or need working on them. Oh, and by the way, I'll also talk about sustainability, because somebody who is thinking about insulation will also have something thought about the environmental impact. I mean, yes, we're all thinking about the cost of energy at the moment, and that's a very live subject. I think there'll become a point where that's become the price we're paying for gas and electricity will become either it'll come down or it will normalize, and we'll just accept that's the price of it, and it was going to be horrible, but we'll accept it, and therefore people will stop having they'll stop taking actions. But people will still think about environmental impact, and we know that that awareness is growing rapidly. It's increasing a lot, particularly with not just younger buyers, but some older buyers are thinking about it as well. You know, if so start talking more about energy efficiency plus.
It is, but what I would recommend, and this comes back to talking to your clients, is just ask them, what do they know about sustainability and homes? You know, what do they know? You might find that they know a lot, and that will help you know how to tailor your report. Or they might want your advice on something in particular, and you know, you can give them support. I mean, ultimately, customers and clients just want a pat on the head to say, you did a good job, you're doing a good job buying this house, and you've made a good decision having insulation. They just want to know that they're on the right track and where they're to pull the plug unless it's a major thing. So if they've already got an idea of what they want, you're halfway there in terms of reporting on a lot of this, because you're making suggestions, and you can come across as really helpful without actually committing to a lot in your report. That's the thing that people miss. There's a comment here which I don't quite understand, but I'll read it out. It's about electric car charging points. Requirement S3 for residential buildings undergoing major renovation might cover leasehold management companies.
Yeah, as I get it, I mean, I know obviously there's what was it? It's the obligation. And I know any new build with over 10 units now will have to include some form of car charging. I didn't know that would anything on the major renovation. I'd only seen it recently, so I've only sort of half skimmed it. If it was, I believe leases generally are structured to allow compliance with the law. So if it became legal obligation to meet it, then you perhaps could do it through the service charge, and I think that would be one way around it. But I think it's still. I don't know how we're going to. What's major renovation? A block of flats that's just being maintained. Well, that's never
To be
going to
honest, they haven't got the electricity supply for a lot of these charging points.
You can't connect it to each flat. You can't connect it to communal supply.
In which case, you can only report on what you know at a point in time and signpost them to, most local authorities have got, watch this space or sign up to this newsletter and signpost them to the most local information that you've got, and
Marion, can I just join in on that?
Yeah,
It was my question. I only just came across, a bit like you, Tim, came across part S and sat down and read it a few weeks ago. And it was quite an interesting point in that the major renovation doesn't include replacing the cladding on the outside of a building. So if you've got a block of flats with, doesn't matter how many car parking bays they've got, and they're replacing the cladding following Grenfell, that doesn't count. But if they're resurfacing the car park, that does. And so at that point, if there are more than 10 bays in an existing building, they're under an obligation under S3 to put in electric car charging points. Now, there's quite a lot of detail in the approved document, but it is something that when in your presentation when you said that under the lease they're not allowed to, but I would have thought in order to comply with the law, then they'll have to.
They'll have to, yeah.
But again, we come back to how is it going to be charged? So they're going to have to put pay per use points in there, aren't they? Because they connect it up to the communal supply. How are they going to recharge that cost back to the leasehold? So the communal supply can really split. Usually leases are written, you pay your percentage and that's it.
Well, it's going to be a massive headache for a lot of the the management companies, because car parking is like one of the biggest contentious things.
One of the main reasons I left property management was car parking.
But
again, people get really, really quite het up about car parking, and this is why I would say to people, look, if you know you've got to get an electric car, then you'll know you're never going to be able to park it outside your flat because you're going to have to park it down where the charging station is. I wouldn't like that.
And again, it's highlighting, it's almost like this peanut bar contains nuts kind of thing, in that it's pretty obvious when near the car park, but check the legal side. And it's keeping that conversation going with the client as well, because these things will change. They'll try and implement it and realize that they can't. And then we'll get a new housing minister
next week or the week after as normal.
Any other questions from anybody? Was that I found that a really useful session. I don't know if everybody else had. Do pop in the chat if there's any questions or any feedback on that. But thank you, Tim.
That's all right. So I encourage people.
I think it's a really important thing to talk about, and if it's not something we should be worried about either.
No.
Our reports are living, breathing documents that should always move forward. And the more we talk about, I get very disheartened when I see people, saying surveys aren't worth it, worth what they're, the money you paid, and probably the ones they haven't, but you've got to keep on telling people your worth and what you're able to help them with. And I think this is a really, really good angle. In terms of CPD courses and that, maybe we can pop some of them in the hub.
I can't remember the name of the course. One again, I saw it.
We'll pop a post, or somebody can ask in the hub. Everybody knows everybody there, and has probably got some ideas. But thank you all. We've got another one of these coming up in February on an introduction to compulsory purchase with Dan Knowles. And I've got some others in the pipeline, but I can't remember what they are.
You're doing one next week about children, aren't you, or something?
That was yesterday.
Yes,
which was really good, yeah. And I'm going to put all of these on my website, on a website page, so people can just access them. But it's nothing better than being in the virtual room when you can ask them questions. So and if anyone's got any topics that they want to have, you know, happy to host these. And if you want to have a go at presenting something, please do, you know.
It's fun, except unless when Marion's pressing the wrong buttons and it all goes.
Yeah, I'm the one that's going to.
That won't happen again.
And even if you've never presented before, you know, it's giving these things a go. All right then, guys and gals, you look after yourself. Thanks a lot, Tim. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.